All right. Hi, everybody. I have no idea how many people are going to be watching this live as we're doing this, but I wanted to do this live because the person I'm talking to in just a moment is someone I have so much respect for. I really admire the work she's been doing. And if you watch this channel for any reason, then I think you would get a kick out of her too. So I wanted to make sure you knew who she was. So I'm going to bring her in here and I'll give her a chance to introduce herself in just a moment here. This is Kristiana de Leon.
Hello.
And hi. And
Hi.
I will give you a second to
Yeah.
tell people about yourself and what you were doing, what you're running for. And I'm gonna just leave up this link below for anyone who wants to support your campaign.
Yay.
It's bit.ly/KDL, Kristiana de Leon, for LD5. And that's how they could support your campaign. And can you tell us who you are? You don't have to go on forever because I have other questions I want to ask you, but who you are, what you're running for, and why our audience, I guess, might be interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you also again for this opportunity. I'm really excited. And also, by the way, thank you for what you were doing too for the Association of Secular Elected Officials. I believe it was just over a month ago or about such. And that was really, really great for us. So the Association of Secular Electeds, before I get into myself, is a nonprofit organization that is for elected officials who identify with the secular movement, be they humanists, atheists, free thinkers, however that label kind of rolls for them, and trying to converge that sort of part of our identity with really meaningful policy, whether or not that's traditionally considered part of the secular universe or not. So I wanted to just thank you also for helping our organization with providing funds so that we can create more policy hubs and more opportunities for secular elected officials after the election session. So just wanted to put that in there as well, that Association of Secular Elected Officials can also use some love too. But my name is Kristiana de Leon. I am actually currently serving on the Black Diamond City Council. I have been since 2019. So for those of you who don't know, because it is a small town, Black Diamond is named after coal, and we're in the southeast part of King County, Washington. And my ability to serve came from an opportunity that arose from when I was teaching in the public schools locally. And I decided, after all of the advocacy work I was doing, especially to create more inclusive environments in our schools, that I wanted to take that to the next level by creating more of those kinds of partnerships and programs in my city. So fast forward, because I'm really fast forwarding to now, I won my reelection unopposed this past year. And people in the community were asking, so, there's an open house seat in our state legislature. We would love to see your representation and advocacy continue in Olympia. And I was like, well, I mean, see if it's in the cards. And they made it in the cards for this to be a really, really viable campaign, which is exciting. So I am running for the state legislature, 5th legislative district, as a Democrat. And I'm really excited to be able to do that, especially because I really care about public education as a top priority, as well as because I'm in a small and traditionally more rural but vastly growing town. What that looks like for how our city better implements climate change policies and healthcare access, since a lot of the conversation still revolves predominantly around more urban communities. So that's a little bit for me.
That's awesome. You said something that I've heard from other friends or acquaintances, which is that you were very passionate about certain causes locally. So you got active locally. You were, and uh, whether it was school board meetings, city council issues, you were always advocating for certain things. And because of that, because you were kind of making a reputation for yourself as someone who was fighting for those causes, they pushed you to run for city council, which you did successfully. And I believe, how long have you been on the city council now in Black Diamond?
Yeah, since the end of 2019, since I was able to unseat an incumbent, and I was able to finish their last month just due to some state state
So
rules.
so it's been about 5 years now, and the fact that they're saying, "We like what you're doing on here. We want you to push this to a higher level, so all the advocacy you're doing locally, we could try to do it at a state level too," which is again, I think so many people have this fear of, How do you get to that level? And the answer you're giving is it starts out locally because you care about these issues.
That's right. I mean, so I'm thinking about the long trajectory that took me to being able to serve in public office really came from, well, first off, if you've ever taught high school or middle school, like you're already a little bit like cracked to begin with. So you might as well just kind of, a little bit of what you're getting into, because sometimes in a lot of cases, politics is kind of like middle school while adulting. But actually, in terms of the advocacy part, I found myself, especially in 2018, being incredibly frustrated with, the news cycle going on, and especially with like the Brett Kavanaugh fiasco. And I remember being really, really upset about how powerless I felt at some of the bigger national and international news cycles. And then I was like, I can also at least help with making sure that we don't have our own local Brett Kavanaughs, which is actually something that came up in a local legislative race. And I got involved and I volunteered. And I saw what happened when we volunteered and we won. We won. Like that organizing paid off. And it changed the conversation in that region. And that's actually what happened in my community as well. I mean, I'm actually reflecting on the fact that I have been serving in a traditionally more conservative part of the county and the state, because Washington State is not, surprisingly, completely blue. It's really not. And I'm thinking about that. Like, I'm thinking about how we went from caring about something locally and realizing I can at least start uber locally, and then how that can actually send that ripple effect to up the ballot as well. So my city has been able to really avoid, I'd say, a lot of disasters about what would have happened should I have not stepped up and run. Also, like, we would have had a far right militia leader being able to just claim that he represented our city had nobody stepped up and challenged that. So I can't emphasize enough that as overwhelming as the national news cycle is, there's really, really good work to be done locally that can have ripple effects in the opposite direction up.
I think it always upsets me when there are bad candidates, not just bad candidates on the ballot, they have a right to run, but it's when they go unopposed because it just feels so daunting to beat that sort of person. But when you don't give anyone a choice, what are they going to do?
Right.
What have you learned from being on the other side, from actually sitting on city council for 5 years, that maybe you didn't realize when you were just an advocate trying to get those people to listen to you?
Oh my gosh. I mean, talk about like every single year I've been on council has felt like one of my most transformative years in my life. Like, and I know that can sound like hyperbole. I can't emphasize enough, though, how much being able to serve and kind of be able to listen to people, get more involved in the policy, make those community connections. I just think of how every single opportunity I get is a chance for growth. And I know that sounds like kind of vague booking almost in a sense, but I really think about my 2019 self of being that, the burned out teacher who just really wanted to make sure that we were setting up our communities more for success, to be more welcoming and inclusive, and to create more better environmental policy. I could go into more of that too. But how much I've been able to learn as a result. And I also really testify, I can really attest to how fantastic it was that I had the opportunity to run in a competitive race, which I know sounds a little bit like counterintuitive, but it forced me to really listen to so many different perspectives and people. And I love doorbelling. Like, I'm actually really introverted, but I love the opportunity to get to people's doors and talk policy and hear what's on their mind, because one of the number one things that I tell also candidates when they're running is how important doorbelling is, not just for getting out the vote, but how you keep those stories with you. And it continues to inform what you do in policy. So I guess to kind of answer that, I think of that journey of what I heard and hoped to be doing and what I now get to be doing now. Maybe I have more perspective. Maybe things didn't always turn out the way we wanted them to, but now I also have more of an understanding of the sausage making too.
Sure. Tell me a little bit about that perspective, because as
Yeah.
someone who's on the advocacy side of things, I know I'm very stubborn in that regard, that to me, so many issues are black and white. But I also believe that if I were in your shoes as a representative, whether it's city council or state legislature, I would have to put my own beliefs to some extent on the back burner, because I'm not just representing myself anymore. Do you have any stories of times when you felt so strongly about something, but when you were campaigning in a competitive race or when you were sitting on city council, you heard from somebody who, as an advocate, you probably disagreed with, but now that you're hearing their side of the story, it's like, okay, I do have to represent you because, I mean, that is literally my job. But this is something that if I weren't sitting on city council, maybe I would be on the total polar opposite side. I don't know if that question makes sense.
No, I'm thinking of a lot of different perspectives. It does make sense. And I'm kind of one of those people, if people haven't caught yet, I'm one of those folks who does kind of think about like the interconnectedness of issues. So like I'm going in a bunch of different directions with that question already. So very, very locally, I can speak to an issue related to wake surfing on our lake and how I took one perspective in one sense. And then after hearing from community, I changed my opinion more to make sure that it was responsive to what residents actually said they wanted. So I wasn't just imposing what I thought was the best idea, but really listening to residents and getting more of a consensus on how we share the lake and recreate responsibly. So that's a really hyper local example. But I think maybe what's also relevant to me, but also of course to your audience, is where that then intersects with being a secular elected official and being part of the secular community. So my very short version of how I would speak to my own views as being a humanist and an atheist includes what I think actually really applies to everybody, which is I don't believe that there is any, life after this one. And I really passionately believe about in making sure that everyone has the greatest opportunity for having the greatest quality of life that they can. And so that kind of continues to inform where I kind of set, maybe in a sense, some healthy policy making boundaries. And by that, I mean healthy boundaries, hopefully for the community. So for example, I draw the line at dehumanizing policies and rhetoric on anti-trans legislation and comments, or, just really bigoted stuff like that. And I also think about what we share in common. And again, even at the higher levels, I think about local issues like, well, we drink from the same water source and we drive the same roads. So I might have serious concerns about some of the dehumanizing aspects of our political rhetoric. And again, that's now national coming local. But guess what? At the end of the day, we're drinking kind of the same water. So maybe even if some of it turns into Kool-Aid, we still have to make sure that we're providing the greatest quality of life for folks, even in the midst of this kind of political environment.
I wanted to ask about one thing I've seen you be really strongly advocating for, and this is a statewide issue, but I'm wondering if you could tell us about it. What's going on with clergy and mandated reporters? Because I know this is a bill that has come up.
Yeah.
Can you tell people what the issue is, what you're trying to fight for the lawmakers to do, and where we're at right now with that?
Yeah. How about I start from the most recent, which is where we're at right now, which is that I don't know what's going to happen next session. It's still an unresolved issue. So that's a spoiler so far, is that there is no ending yet. So what happened is, so in Washington State, we are one of the few states left now in the country that has not included clergy, like religious leaders, regardless of their actual title, to be mandated reporters, and I'm a former teacher. So for me, I know what goes into being a mandated reporter. And for me, that hat never really comes off. And especially because a lot of the work that I care about, it also includes child welfare and advocacy and mental health support. And for me, just preventing abuse is part of the suite of mental health services and concerns. So anyway, Washington State doesn't include clergy to be mandated reporters yet. And there have been attempts over, I believe now, the decades to finally rectify that. And now and this is where Washington gets really wonky, and why I think it's really important for viewers to recognize that we're not this blue monolith, right? We have so many weird quirks, and that also includes our kind of, I guess, hand-wringing over how we make sure that we actually, for example, keep kids safe. So because of my work on the Association of Secular Elected Officials, I was able to first learn that we didn't have this on the books through some other webinars we did. So then I started talking with some legislators that I thought, would be especially intrigued to kind of work on this issue. And I finally learned that there was a bill that was being proposed that would make sure that clergy were added as mandated reporters. So like if they see child abuse, if they suspect child abuse or neglect, they have to tell, they have to tell the authorities, right?
And this seems like it should be a gimme.
Yeah.
Like even religious organizations should say, well, yeah, we want to protect the children. So if we learn about it, of course we're going to do what's in the child's best interest.
Right. And you'll often actually, and this is what's interesting, is by and large, you will hear religious leaders saying that they're for this. And this adds the extra interesting layer to all of this. So here's what happened also is the bill was actually probably just going to sail through a few years ago. And that was because some of the folks working on the bills, including Democratic lawmakers, were really working closely with the Catholic Conference, with the Bishops' Lobby Group, to make sure that also there were exemptions such as confession. That was where we actually, also with atheist organizations, including with the American Atheists and American Humanists Association, we stepped in to say, why are we making exemptions for child abuse? And that was what actually caused much more of the controversy this time around, which was saying we shouldn't provide any aiding and abetting of child abuse. So last session, that was about to go.
There are actual stories of people, like abusers, going into a confessional booth, telling a priest, yeah, I have abused a kid. It's happening right now. And then the problem here is the priest says, well, that sucks. Oh, well, say some Hail Marys, but I'm not going to report that even if it could save the child because you told it to me in this act of confession. You would think it's a gimme to say, yeah, but if that seems like a fair exception to the rule of whatever your code of secrecy is.
Yes. And that's what's so, that's just what something of that makes my blood boil, because I'm thinking about how when I was a teacher, to me, the biggest parallel I can draw, even though I know this is not what the religious organizations would be comparing, is like if a parent were to go to a student conference night and disclose that they were abusing a kid to me, it'd be like saying, oh, well, you disclosed it at a PTA night or at conferences, so therefore I don't have to tell anybody. And that's the way I see this is, yes, there are acts in certain faiths that are sacred, and yet what is sacred about protecting child abuse? And to me, that's where I think the state really does need to step up and say, we're protecting vulnerable children, vulnerable people in general, that don't necessarily, they didn't even choose the religion. They're showing up and they should be safe in their house of worship. And that was, to kind of get ahead of myself.
And usually when you want to interfere with some religious belief, there has to be an overwhelmingly good reason for the state to get involved in something like that. And if preventing a child from getting abused doesn't cut it, what the hell does?
Well, exactly. And I think this is, I should probably take a step back because I'm, in the world of mandated reporter training, you have to do that to be licensed as a teacher. And at least in Washington, I'm sure pretty much everywhere, I'd hope. But yeah, you have to tell the information that and you have to go through a bunch of questions to say as much information as you can provide. And even if it's a really vague understanding, I heard a kid who sounded like they were under 10 years old. They told me this. It was at this place that they told. You just provide what you know. You don't have, and that's really the big issue to all of this is even if you don't know the full story, the full name or anything like that, share what you know. It's almost like it's kind of funny that we're calling it the Good Samaritan law, right? I realize that's biblical, but recognizing that's kind of part of it. You're trying to avoid the bystander effect, and so. The fact that this is the huge argument is that this breaks the seal of confession, and that we heard from the bishop lobby groups that priests would rather go to jail than, kind of creating this martyrdom narrative of we would rather go to jail than support an abused child is unconscionable. And the fact that, again, even in my own party, we were kind of coddling this, more than kind of, we were coddling this, is deeply upsetting to me because that's an abuse of the First Amendment.
Sure. And so just to get back to the point here,
Mhm.
you are advocating for them to pass this bill to make sure clergy are mandated reporters, regardless of how they found out about, alleged abuse. And why is that? So, and obviously these bishops, Catholic Church representation, maybe the Mormon Church as well, they are fighting on this. And why do the Democrats, are they pushing forward with it anyway, or are they folding like immediately?
Yeah, so that's the next wrinkle of the story from last year to this year. And I should really give shout outs also, because I was thinking about the chilling stories you were mentioning. Through this work, I was able to connect both with, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, who were actually, one of whom was actually the whistleblower for this major abuse cover up with the Jehovah's Witnesses that became news in Investigate West. And that's actually what really kicked off this work for this. The last few iterations of this kind of bill was really the work of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. But also I've been able to connect with survivors of clergy abuse in the Catholic Church. And the last time I think we were connecting, I was actually about ready to stand with them, literally, in front of the Attorney General's office in Olympia to create a set of demands, including that they want a hotline for, an abuse hotline, and they want more of a public investigation for the Attorney General. And I realize that this is kind of getting a little bit off, but it's relevant to this of also talking about, we have a Democratic Attorney General, a Democratic Governor's Office, all of these points, and we're still not listening to survivors when it comes to the case of abuse when it happens in a church setting.
Are they just worried about the pushback from the religious? Is that all?
I think so. I think there's a lot of hand wringing, and to me, maybe at least my impression of this, I'd be glad to be proven wrong, is this is almost this seems to be an extension of the sort of passive aggressive Pacific Northwest nice that we have, where we want to be like, I'm tolerant, so therefore I'm going to tolerate what should be otherwise in any other setting intolerable. So, this has been a coalition of work where people who are survivors are pushing back, including these survivors of Catholic, clergy abuse, who are still Catholics, who are saying, look, this is my faith. I still believe in the tenets of this religion. I just don't believe in what church leadership is doing. And we're still ignoring that. And that this goes to that point of the First Amendment, where suddenly, whose First Amendment rights are we now restricting? Because here now we have children. We have active parishioners who say, I don't feel safe in church. So who are we protecting here now? And again, that goes back. And is it even the First Amendment? I'd say no.
Let me change gears for a second. If you were in office, what could you do as a sitting lawmaker that maybe you can't do right now?
Yes.
At
So
least on this issue.
yeah, especially this issue. So this has the extra layer to the story. I like how the question keeps telling a little bit more of the story each time. So what we ended up with this last session, really interestingly, was between last and this session, more of the exemption issue came to be the focal point of the bills. So last year, especially thanks to House committee members, they said, no, we should remove the exemption for child abuse in clergy, in confession settings. Like that's just, that is a no starter if we allow abuse to be, kind of given cover of darkness in a confession booth or whatever similar practice there is in other faiths as well. So that actually became the rub between last session and this session, was the Senate, even though it's controlled by Democrats, refused to really move the needle on issues related to the clergy bill. The House was for saying no exemptions. A lot of Democratic lawmakers, and I think some Republicans, if I recall correctly, were okay with it. But there were enough people who were on the fence about this to create that bill fizzling out, let's say. So this last session, that would be what I do. I mean, yes, I'm running for the House position, which is not where necessarily the biggest hangup is, although I really want to make sure that even as a House member, I am advocating with senators to say, no, there should be no excuse for child abuse. And at least the prime sponsor of these bills in the Senate side, Senator Noel Frame, doing amazing work, was a House rep. So I do think that there's a lot more to be done for making sure that we have those allies in the House and the Senate to really make a concerted effort. And that's where, again, I'm a coalition builder. a lot of my policy work, and especially so I could survive and really get things done locally, came from the fact that I know it can't always happen in the halls of power, which I think goes back to your original question of how you get involved as an activist and how you learn what's changed. Is I really think a lot about, I know the impact of what happens when there are committed activists, or just people in general in the community who care. I mean, regardless of whether or not they call themselves activists, who really put pressure on lawmakers. So feeling that side and understanding that and knowing how to work with those stakeholders is also what moves the needle. That's how I'm running. That's how I've been serving. So that's what I would just be continuing at a different level in Olympia.
Yeah, I feel like this is something I've heard. Again, Washington, a different state than, say, a Democrat in a very red state. But sometimes, even if you can't get the bill you want, being able to advocate for it from that position gives it a little more seriousness. It makes people listen to you a little more when you're in that position and using your leverage, whatever you have, to push for it. That helps.
Yeah.
Not to change the subject from that one thing, but there's so much I want to ask you about. One thing I've always thought about, you mentioned this. I think of Washington State as a fairly blue state, even though there are rural areas there. And Democrats have a reputation for basically relying on urban voters, and more or less ignoring rural voters. But Black Diamond, I believe, is a relatively rural place. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. How do you and how does your party find a way to connect with those voters who Democrats have, for better or for worse, ignored?
That is like the bulk of exactly why I'm running too, is really to continue to shed that light on what it means to be a rural or more exurban Democrat, or just person in general in this state. I mean, I don't know how much all of your listeners wanted to go into how wild the scene is right now in some of the big urban areas like Seattle. For a long time, Seattle was kind of given the boogeyman reputation, especially in far right outlets. There have been some weird changes to areas like Seattle. I would say right now it's like a phoenix with its head cut off, and it's going through a little bit of a whatever life crisis it is in now. So this is the other part of where I think it's really important for us to be working more cohesively, including as a state, is there are, I mean, I could go into so many examples about policy-wise where both, especially the Senate, failed to do some things, but also on how we need to make sure that we're bringing along rural folks on for the ride, and especially when it comes to housing policies and transportation access and on the environment. So here's a very good local example of where I'm frustrated right now with how I also think our party needs to do better with listening to more rural voters. So very locally, and actually this is a huge topic of conversation in my community, there might be the chance that we're going to change a green space essentially to allow for a gravel mine, which is going to literally poison the well. That's going to create huge deleterious effects on rural communities, regardless, again, of what they, who they actually vote for otherwise. And this is where I think, I don't know if we'll agree on every single social issue, but yeah, you should have safe water and a safe road to live in. And if you live in a rural community, you should be able to, trust that this is a place that, stays green, and keep the urban areas urban and make sure that we're preserving our green spaces. So I think to really answer those questions, though, also about what that means for that rural urban divide, is I do live in a more rural area. And I wanted an area too where people said, Democrats can't win, and especially maybe a more secular person can't win. We can. And I do think it's to our huge disservice in this state that we continue to ignore more rural communities because we think we don't have the votes, which is cynically what I've actually been told, even in this election, is, well, where you live, you just don't have the votes. And it's like, this is why we don't actually do the things we need to do in Washington. And this is where I think it goes to the cultural question of where we are as a state. Is we are continuing to exacerbate this issue, where suddenly we think about the urban areas as kind of getting more of the support, more of the resources, including on transportation issues, and suddenly we leave the rural folks kind of out there on their own. And that's at least the feeling. Whether or not that's true, that's the perception. And I think electorally that does kind of bode as well. I don't know if that answers the question, but this is the whole reason why I'm running. Is I was actually just flat out told that we're more rural, so we don't have as many voters. So why should I care?
When you've knocked on doors in those areas where I'm guessing they're not used to seeing a lot of Democrats come into their homes, what's the reaction been when you speak with them?
Yeah, well, for one, I'm really excited that there have been so many times when even more conservative folks said, yeah, even if I don't agree with you on everything, I know where you stand. And I trust that. And I think that's a really key piece that we can't emphasize enough, is especially in this political climate, including when we've seen times when that our dialogue has gone off the rails. It's often been because people just want a clear answer about where somebody stands. So I've gotten a lot of even somebody saying, you tell it like it is. And I'm like, right. I mean, I'm still like floored that I got that answer. And I'm like, well, I mean, in this case, I think when I'm talking about, human rights and the environment, I think that is what it is. But anyway, to that point, there's that aspect. I don't know. I'm thinking about so many different parts of that as well. But also when I'm at the doors, people say, I still remember my first time running where somebody was asking about our governor, because at the time he was running for president. And they asked him all these questions about like China and, climate change. And I'm like, I can't do anything about whatever China decides to do, but let's go back to talk about the bears and the elk on your lawn in our wetlands. And they're like, yeah, I might not agree with you on the national stuff, but if you can help with the elk in my yard, I'll vote for you. And so,
That's
yeah,
not, I've heard this not personally, but from like a transgender candidate who ran in a very red area where they said all the stuff that comes up when we think about civil rights, LGBTQ rights, by and large, I'm not running for those issues, even though we may disagree on those issues. I'm running to fix your potholes. I'm running to get businesses in our community. And on those issues that are more local, more state level, you'll find a lot more overlap between partisans at the national level, I would imagine.
yeah, yeah. And I recall hearing that story from the candidate that you were talking about and going, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Like all of these things are so crucial to our own personal identities, but also in the fabric of our democratic institutions. And at the end of the day, what matters is that we're trying to improve people's quality of life. And again, I think that's where I think there's a really unique lens of what it means to be a humanist and atheist in office, to say, I just want us to have nice things because I don't know if we're going to get another shot at this.
Let me ask you, just so everyone's aware. So you are currently running for the state legislature. Can you give us the layout of how that works specifically in Washington? Your primary is coming up, I believe, next week. But like, how does that work? Is it just how many candidates are in the race? Who are you running against in the primary? Is there any weirdness going on in Washington that may not apply to other states?
We're I still like to say we're the better Washington. We're definitely the weirder Washington. So first off, I guess it'll be interesting to know that we have a little bit more time on the primary. In fact, we have 5 more months. So we have an August primary where it's the first Tuesday of the month. So I have a little more time, which is great.
Oh, good.
It does,
Sorry about
yeah.
that. My
Oh,
mistake.
no. You're good. I know most people, again, we're the weirder Washington. Maybe I should just call it that way. And also to kind of add to that level for the primaries is we have an interesting system of the top 2 primaries, the top 2 system, which means regardless of your party, the 2 highest vote getters move on, which has meant that there have been times even on statewide races where it's been Democrat versus Democrat, or Republican versus Republican. It does happen that way. So I don't know what it's going to look like for this particular race, because I feel like I've been going a mile a minute already, and but for a lot of people, they're just starting to really, really tune in. So who knows how many more people will jump in, but there are, I want to say now 4 more people in addition to me, and now Republicans too, which, adds an interesting level and dynamic to the conversation as well. And I think to the earlier question, at least what that means for my LD race is in my legislative district, we've had representation from 1 city in a pretty big geographic space. You can say what you want about redistricting. It was awful. But this is where people also ask me to run, is you have additional perspectives that can inform and help the rest of this legislative district and the rest of our state. Because right now we have a lot of policies being made and advocated for in our legislative district that really reflects the interests of that city and its own dynamics, which includes that it has the political and economic capital to do some of the housing and environmental social programs that other cities like mine simply can't. Like, I could go into also issues related to, our tax policy and how we're cash strapped in small rural towns. I won't here. That's not the question. But I do think that that's what's going to make this an interesting race here in this very local race is we might have other Democrats, but it's also going into the sense of who is going to actually be representing our full communities and who's going to be giving all of our communities the time of day to really care about these issues. And I think also to some extent, how much are we going to be too worried about playing it safe and not really delving into the fact that we have some serious cultural, conversations that we need to have, and how are we going to address them? Like, how are we going to address the fact that I'm living in an area where we had Moms for Liberty threatening people I love and care about? And I think to that question about the state politics, we have a lot of that. And I think because of that exacerbated like rural and urban, and in addition to party lines, we're really seeing that come to an impasse in our state because we do. And I think especially in comfortably blue areas, we think of this as an abstract, it's out over there. And people have told me, like, I wouldn't even canvass in Black Diamond because it's too scary. And it's like, but this is where the action needs to happen. I know this is kind of going in a few different directions from your original question, but
no, it's okay.
Yeah.
So I have other candidates jumped into the same race yet? They have already, and there are Democrats in that race already. How do you stand out from those other Democrats, and how do you make a case for yourself without necessarily, I guess, putting them down if they're the ones on the ballot or something? Because I imagine that's this fine line you have to tiptoe around. Like, how do you stand out and make your case for why you're the Democrat that people should vote for?
Yeah, I think, in my ramblings, and I'll admit it was rambling in the earlier question, was kind of getting to that same question where we do have more of a crowded primary now. And it is interesting that, again, I was asked to run because, community leaders out in my part of the district asked me to run to make sure that we were bringing more attention to the rest of the district and really in ways that I think help the rest of the state, because I live in a rural area that's growing like wild, like astronomically, due to some state policy issues we won't get into, but really saying we need to have more direct attention on where are the work that we're talking about, the growth in the state is happening most. And I feel like that's being excluded. And so that's the choice that I think, voters in my area are going to have to be making, is about how much attention are we going to give to communities like mine, or are we going to give it lip service and then continue to repeat the same way of doing things in the hopes that it trickles down to, and I do actually mean trickles down to places like mine, even though we're higher up geographically. So, I've been involved in trying to build the bench out here locally because I knew what it meant for my race. But we'll have to see what pans out here as well, because we do have other Democrats. And I'd say that there's, like any Democratic race, we have those interesting dynamics of how much do we want to, be status quo, and how much do we want to make sure that we're really, I think, being more bold in how we bring people and new people along.
I'm very curious. I don't know the answer to this. I don't know if you can answer this, but what's the coordination like between your campaign with, let's say, the state Democratic Party? Is there any discussions with them? Are they secretly telling you, we need you to do the following? Like, what? Or are they ignoring you entirely? Which I don't know if that would make me feel better, or like, no, they have a total grasp on you and they tell you how to do things. I don't know which one of those is better, where you lie, somewhere in the middle of that spectrum somewhere.
I mean, I guess the official answer is that we do have some apparatus with like party politics where, they say that we'll be watching, we're more hands off at this point. Please, make sure that you're using, you're working with, staff who we think are going to uphold our democratic values. They do that. But of course, like anything in politics, it gets a lot more messy, a lot more quickly, which I think is actually just adding to my levels of my whys for why I'm running, is because I've been involved enough in, local and state the state and local political process to know that we as Democrats do a really good job, and especially for more vulnerable communities, and not just rural, but of course, people of color and trans people and you name it, where we say we really want these votes. We really want your votes. And then we kind of, that's often the first, communities to be sacrificed on the altar of compromise. And I guess the more I run, the more I see that up close and personal. And it both really saddens me, but it also continues to make me more fiery and more committed to running to win and also to tell these stories. So, I mean, maybe that's a whole other conversation for a whole other time, or maybe more local people want to get into the weeds more on that exactly. But I can at least say that for all the reasons that often people get disgusted and end up leaving the process, I at least I can say I empathize with it greatly. Like, I feel that. And to me, that's why I'm running, is I'm tired of feeling that way. And I feel like, again, this is our one life. And if the planet's on fire, let's do what we can to really make things better.
How can you make a case? This is stepping outside your personal campaign, but how do you make a case to people for why they need to vote for Biden as the Democratic nominee come November, no matter what the issues are with him? Because it seems like the Democratic Party, by and large, is not making that case very strongly right now. What would you be telling voters who are saying, okay, I like you, but I'm not sure about the guy at the top of the ticket?
Those feelings are valid. This is actually a really good follow-up to where I think I was trying to get at earlier, actually, which is that I'm actually personally sad right now, that I feel like a lot of, in the interest of just winning the election and thinking of these short-term gains, we are really missing the mark that I think would actually better create short-term gains by not addressing the very real concerns that people have. Like, I think I said in my personal capacity, but like, no amount of dark brand and memes are going to convince me that, the economy is truly working for all of us when we see rising income inequality. Like, I'm a millennial, and I think I heard in a panel recently in the Capitol that, millennials, two-thirds of millennials don't have savings for retirement. And I say, my original retirement plan was to be pushed out into an ice floe, but with climate change, I won't even have that. So, I jest a little bit, but to that point, when I think about Biden, yeah, I'm voting for Biden when it's Biden versus Trump. There's no question about that. But locally, I think this will be of real interest, is locally in Washington state, our primaries on March 12th, there's been a local push for voting uncommitted on the ballot. So how it works in Washington state is you have to just first declare, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Like, you just have to check that box. And then after that, you can say, okay, so now that you've said you're a Democrat or a Republican, vote on only the party you said. So you have to say I'm a Democrat, and then you say, so because I'm a Democrat, here's how I'm voting. And now there's a push, and especially because both local labor unions and people who really want Biden to do more, to really stand up to the atrocities that are being committed in Gaza, to say we want to put Biden on notice. So there's been a campaign recently for bubbling in uncommitted, and at least for me, I'll just disclose that's part of that. That is what I did, not because I won't vote for Biden, but because I really believe in know better, do better. And I'm a really big believer in primaries where we can generate authentic conversation. Like, that's for my race, but I really mean that in general. So for me, I'm saying, look, we actually have serious concerns about inaction on, look, I recognize that Biden has inherited the worst disaster ever. And that, we also have like the absolute worst Speaker of the House we could ever have. And for me, that vote is less on Biden and more on telling the Democratic Party that we need to stop ignoring the very real pain that people have to pretend it's okay for, I would posit that the base that's least impacted by the pain of where that inaction is still happening. I hope that makes sense. But to me, I think that it's, so again,
you can send a message now.
Send a message that says and for me, that's saying, yeah, I'll still vote for you. In the meantime, just know that's not a blank check. And I don't like the idea of thinking just because I'm a Democrat, you can get away with things. Like,
Mhm.
I really think that accountability is for all of us. And for me, especially when I've seen a lot of hurt happening from inside the party, and a lot of the same things we would not have accepted if it were Republicans, say, okay, since you don't think it's good to be exclusionary or be dismissive of people living in poverty, or, people who are trans, why would we accept that in our own party? So that's where I'm at, because I just really want to make sure that we are having that dialogue so that we don't keep repeating the short-term gains.
This is a side question, but you alluded to the fact that a lot of the reason you're motivated to run and you're working so hard to make these changes happen is because of your humanist values, that this is the only life we have. I'm wondering, how do you reconcile the small, but they exist, group of people who say they are atheists, they are humanists, well, they're atheists, um, but they want to vote for Republicans for whatever the issue is that they care about. And listen, I've tried to do this on my own. I cannot make sense of it, but I'm wondering if you have any idea for how they reconcile those two worlds.
I can't say I always do myself either. I think this is where a lot of us, more progressive atheists, often find greater solidarity within the faith community that at least shares our shared values, especially on income inequality and on human rights and the environment and all those things that are always interconnected anyway. Because I will say, I feel like sometimes where I'm sure you would agree that it can often feel like hurting cats with Democrats, and then it's like really hurting feral cats when it comes to the progressive atheist movement. So then you have a few more barn cats that are, the more conservative atheists. And I will say that when I've talked with some of them, I
Damn.
found. Hmm?
Damn independent thinkers doing their own
Right. I
thing.
know. I know. See, I was raised sidebar. I was raised Lutheran, and I think that's really interesting. I went to a Lutheran school that's all about challenging authority and critical thinking. So, congratulations, good job,
Yeah.
PLU. It's like, but yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's a lot of independent thinking. I do think that and again, I'm really big on calling in our own. That's going into my vote on the uncommitted. That comes into the secular movement, where I get sad, and I do speak to when I hear, for example, Islamophobic comments coming from inside the house. Like, we don't do that. We don't put down other communities, and especially historically and currently marginalized communities, to make a statement. Like, we just don't do that. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I have a hard time reconciling that as well. But then that's where maybe it's how I just quickly try to resolve my cognitive dissonance. But I'm just like, but you know what? You still deserve to have a good quality of life, even if you have some thinking to do.
Sure. One thing I wanted to make sure we talk about is, what concerns do you have about public education right now in your state? What are the biggest issues facing public education? Because again, it's Washington. I would think that's a blue state. They're relatively good on this. I would hope they're good on the side of teachers and teacher unions and not banning books and doing all that crazy stuff. But what are the big issues you are worried about in Washington?
The fact that that's actually all still really relevant in Washington. And that's, I think, the biggest issue. And especially if you're in a safe blue spot of the state, and I would even go so far as to say a safe blue spot in my legislative district. Again, that feels really abstract, but that's happening in the here and now. So I alluded to earlier that, it's actually been dangerous, even locally, with school board elections. And I guess I'll just go as far as to say that I had one of the other Democrats in the race for this election actually said that, I shouldn't be running because, for example, our school board elections turned out well. And I said, well, first off, we just avoided disaster, and that's because we worked our butts off. But it's also because, I don't know if we call it well, because we still have Moms for Liberty, and we still had people who risked their lives to support candidates or to be candidates, just running to make sure that, we don't ban books, or that we don't, or that we do want to teach factual history. But people were actually, risking their safety to do this, even out in my neighborhoods. And I can't emphasize enough that I almost think, because of this kind of impasse we're at, people feel both emboldened and desperate in areas like mine. because they're that close to being able to achieve things, but they're not. And that creates that level where it just gets even more violent and scary. So I've actually had to go to local school boards and speak, both either in my personal capacity or saying, hey, I'm also on the city council, to say, don't ban this book, because that was happening even in Democratic majority school boards. And also, most recently, there was an attempt to remove a land acknowledgement, despite huge protests from members of the tribe saying, if you do, for example, if you think it's performative and that's your excuse, maybe make it less performative. So there are huge inroads to make even locally. And again, that's why I say get involved locally, because we had a race where it became a Moms for Liberty versus Moms for Liberty race out where I am. And that's had repercussions that included trying to remove a land acknowledgement just because. But more statewide, because I think that's really getting to your question. And I think that's actually addressing, though, my frustrations with even some of the Democratic apparatus, where we have this conversation going along saying, well, you shouldn't run and I'm more of the preferred candidate because your issues don't matter, really hurts, right? And that's actually having that impact at the state level. So I left teaching, and I was really dismayed to hear that, at least at the time that that this survey came out, that education, like Washington State was supposed to be the number one place to be a teacher. And I was like, well, if this is the best our country can do, I'm not sure if this is okay. And I say this because this is the main policy issue to really get at too, is despite the progressive veneer with Washington State, for example, our tax code is ass backwards. Like, we were 50th in the nation for tax fairness. Like, in other words, disproportionately, we don't have an income tax. So think of all the wealthy businesses, people who live in Washington State, they're not getting taxed on their income. And there's a huge fight right now locally on capital gains. All of this matters because it comes to education funding. So Florida actually edged us out, though, because Florida man makes for bad tax policy. So now we're 49th. All of this is important because we're continuously kicking the can down the road on public education. So this session alone, for example, our Washington State legislature failed to pass a bill to reduce or eliminate school lunch debt. It took a huge struggle just to give para educators a raise to make sure they weren't living in poverty. I would also speak to the fact that we put a lot of onus on all these additional trainings for teachers, including DEI, which is all great and wonderful. And if you're not funding systems equitably, and if you're not creating equitable communities for learning environments, it feels like victim blaming to say, well, teachers just need to, do this and that and get more training, when the issue isn't only on the teachers. I would also say we need to do more focus on admin programs and trainings. So that's a little bit also. Overall, it's a funding issue. Like, we just continuously deprioritize public education spending, and we rely on property taxes. This goes to my concerns with rural communities. So we rely so heavily on property taxes to fund our schools that people do have valid concerns to say, I am on a fixed income and I can't pay this. What are we going to do? So we have bonds and levies that continuously fail in our districts. Almost every district that is represented in my community, because we have 4 districts, have had a bond or levy fail recently. And that's scary. So I think that's answering the question, but it's funding, but it's also about the fact that because I'm a former public school teacher, and before that I worked in a high school counseling office, that I'm seeing where we're getting it wrong as policymakers and really not listening to professionals. And when it matters to listen to teachers, is that actually creates better learning outcomes. Like, trust the professionals like you would in any other profession.
We have one viewer who wanted to chime in and let you know this. I live in a fairly rural purple red county in Washington. Seeing and hearing about the work you do gives me hope.
Oh,
That's
thank you, Caitlin.
lovely. Yeah,
Yes.
really very sweet. And this is just a reminder that anyone who's interested in supporting Kristiana's campaign, there's the link right there somewhere, wherever my finger is. You can go there to support her campaign. I did have a question for you that I don't know I ever hear candidates for any higher office answer, but I'm kind of curious what your media diet is like, because you are very well versed in a lot of these different types of issues that are so important. But I'm wondering, where do you get your information from typically, besides, of course, me, which is really the only source you need?
Oh, yeah, obviously. Honestly,
Obviously.
no, but I mean, I know that was snarky, but actually you do good journalism work.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah,
But yeah,
thank
what
you.
else do you read? What else do
Yeah.
you, what, and I'm also curious, like, hey, let's say you do make it into the legislature. There's a lot of stuff you got to vote on that you can't possibly know a lot about because they cover everything. How are you going to inform yourself when it comes to that too?
Yeah. Okay. Lots of really good stuff to that. So, and I love actually asking that. So, I'm a really big fan of supporting local journalism. So, we have actually a really good local paper out where we are. I mean, local journalism is dying. I mean, it feels like it's on life support, and that's absolutely terrifying to me because what fills the void in a lot of those cases is then misinformation and weird Facebook rants and all of the all of the things that we don't want to have happen, especially when we know that a lot of really good credible sources are behind a paywall, and sometimes the headlines can be misleading or clickbaity, and that just actually adds to the fuel. So I personally make sure to subscribe to my local paper. But then also, there's the Seattle Times, but we also have some really good local publications that are more independent that I follow, because I do really appreciate that there are people taking the time to really delve into issues that often don't fit into like the 2-minute soundbite clip on the local news, where they might just pan out and show the quick story of homelessness or people experiencing homelessness kind of for a sensational bit. And then we have papers that are really speaking to the statistics and the personal stories, both that coalesce into issues that relate to, say, drug abuse issues or to fentanyl, and especially to people experiencing homelessness, and how do people become unhoused, and what are the solutions, what are organizations doing the work. So I listen to a lot of local news, and fortunately we do have, even though local news is overall hurting, we at least still have a lot of that locally. So local NPR stations as well. Goodness, I do subscribe to some national papers, but also I'm kind of funny in this way. But one of my majors is actually in Scandinavian area studies, so I know some Norwegian. So I kind of I like to follow Norwegian papers as part of my diet of news. Also, and funny also that Norway really, at least last I heard, funds papers. Like hint, hint, maybe we should be doing that locally as well, where our governments are just saying, we're not telling you what to publish, but we want to keep you afloat. I don't know. Rough draft thinking on that. But also, this is a really funny one that I think people get a kick out of. But in terms of TV news, my really, really basic cable includes the English language version of Japanese news, NHK. So it's actually a really interesting piece that has some really good documentaries, and an interesting diet where it goes into international issues. You can follow issues related to, say, the Middle East, and then you're just like, here's Japan's perspective on it, or here's the Japanese media's perspective on it. And then it'll go into things like, North Korea launched a missile and everyone's really scared, and then say, but now let's watch a video about the birds of Hokkaido. And it's just a really great dystopian thing that I just enjoy having on as well. So I could go on about news, but I do follow quite a bit in addition to yours.
That's fantastic. No, I love that. I mean, this is the thing that I appreciate, the fact that you're getting so much information from quality sources, ranging from local to everything else. But also, that's an important way to stay involved. And I share your frustration for the death of local journalism. And I hope there's a way at the state level or national level to fix that sometime in the near future. One person asks this question: where can I find your equal in the South?
You.
That's it. I mean, yeah. I mean, that is it.
Yeah.
There's no, I don't want to take from your words here, but there are so many people running in deep red states in the South and the Bible Belt who are fantastic, awesome, progressive people at the local level. And that's where that's where it impacts your life a lot more than it would at the state or national level too. So these people like Kristiana, they're everywhere, but sometimes as voters, you got to seek them out, or like she's saying, be that person and run and give other people that hope.
I mean, I know that was a silly answer, but the longer answer is, again, I think about my first run where I was with somebody who was engaged politically. Like I would volunteer. I got really involved in, I was a weird kid. Okay. Like I still am, but like I got involved and thought this stuff was really interesting when I was younger. I shelved it for a while. But I do think about the fact that I always thought maybe someday I might run for office. And then finally, it's just, I came to this moment in 2019 where I saw the escalation of hate crimes and hate speech in my community. And I was like, I was an 8th grade teacher, and we were teaching a Holocaust unit. And I went to the school board, after I saw really hateful graffiti and other things going on, and saying, you're telling me to teach a Holocaust unit where I tell students, what would you like? Why, like, tell 8th graders, like, there's a reason why we talk about the Holocaust, even though you're in 8th grade. Why would we talk about something that happened 70, 80 years ago in another country? Because it's still relevant now. So I went to the school board and said, if you're telling me to teach Never Again is Now, what are we doing locally to stop it? And that's what really sent me on that trajectory of realizing that sometimes it's just, you got to step up. And I think to answer the question of, how you get your news, you find it also through other people. Like my policy work is also informed by the people I meet along the way, which was also part of how I ended up running for this seat. Is it was through our collective efforts to put more impetus on our school boards and on our city councils to say, we want to have a community that rejects this kind of behavior, and here's what we're going to policy-wise promote instead to make it more welcoming. So to really answer that as well about defining the equal, I ended up challenging, unbeknownst to me, so here I am just wanting to run to make a more inclusive community. A week after I filed, because I made the snap decision, okay, you know what, it's filing week, it's May, I'm just going to do this. A week or so after, one of my friends said, have you seen who your opponent is? And I was like, no, because like I'm a former teacher. I'm like, I thought you would keep a pretty good profile, right? And I see that they are promoting a white Christian nationalist hate group. And then I learned that they're helping lead it, that they're like on that leadership board. And it shocked me because I was like, well, now I just have to win this. And at the very least, like, I'm glad I stood up and I'm, challenging this person. So that's where I really say it's so important that if you don't see someone else doing it, to make sure you are, and to really further that conversation and interrupt harmful ones. To my point earlier, I'm realizing because of this trajectory, my city has interrupted a lot of really harmful behavior because this group that I was challenging, or the leader of this group that I was challenging, their whole point was building the bench. Like they wanted to create a local platform where they could run for higher office. They actually got so notorious, kind of speaking to the Washington State part, that the Washington Post actually picked up on them and actually gave our city a dishonorable mention for having I had to serve with 2 of these people on the board for a while. So that's why I really say that, when it sounds really cheesy to say to be the change, but honestly, I was the burned out teacher who just was really mad and wanted things to be better. And I can't emphasize enough how important that is. And also what I tell candidates is like, I'm really passionate about you telling your story, because whatever brought you to wanting to do this, I mean, unless you're like a far right white Christian nationalist, is valid. Like, and that needs to be part of the conversation.
One viewer, Adam, chimes in, the best person to run for office to share your values is you.
Thanks, Adam.
Absolutely right. Kristiana, in our final moments here, what would be the best way for people who appreciate everything you're saying, whether or not they live in Washington or your legislative district? How can they support you? How can they help you? What is it that you need in the months going forward?
Well, if you'll see the nice little bit.ly down below, really, money is a huge thing, especially if you're living out of state and you're just like, wow, we need more people like her in office. It's like, awesome. And I do say that, like, really, as much as I'd like to say that campaigns don't require money, they do. And the reason why,
can you tell us what that money goes toward in a legislative district race?
Yeah, absolutely. So for one thing, I'm really big on like paying people. Like when I told people, people were first approaching me to run and they said, we want you to be, running for this seat. We really want you in office. And I said, I need a team. And it's partly because I have so many amazing people in my life and so many advocates and so many volunteers. And I know that in order to really run a successful campaign, you can't expect, people, even the most passionate volunteer, to do everything for you. Like, that's just unfair and unrealistic. So, it is paying people. I'm really big on, you're giving your time and your energy to do this, and we can't do it alone. Like, no person can do it alone. Also, like, I love doorbelling, as I mentioned. But also, people do respond well to having literature that explains who you are, especially when you don't get to meet them at the door, and or it's, the 11-year-old opening the door who's leaving something, whatever the case is. That stuff is important. And of course, people need to be paid to create literature for you. And especially because I support unions, and, gotta keep the union folks afloat, all of that. So that's part of it. And it's just making sure that there are constant reminders that I am a choice on the ballot. So, people say, oh, it's, too much money in politics. And it's like, but at the local level, it's really boiling down to the essentials of what it takes to just make sure you have, a viable campaign. And also, I will just put out that in my race, I'm definitely the least financially endowed of the folks running. I can't, quote unquote, buy my race. I mean, if I had any extra money, it goes to my dog's vet bills, right? So I mean, to that end, that's also why it matters. I also just really value the idea that community asked me to run, and having this continuously be community fueled, really, it also just means a lot to me in terms of just seeing that people believe in this. I mean, that's what keeps me motivating too. Not just the anger then, but also the, oh my gosh, you believe in me. This is so
Right.
cool. And thank you for being one of those supporters, by the way.
Absolutely. And I think not to dissuade anyone from donating to Senate races, the presidential campaign, or anything, but if you want more bang for your buck, supporting a local race or a state district race goes a much longer way. And yeah, it's something I've definitely thought about and done more locally too, because, giving whatever I can to a local race, just it means it goes further. It goes a lot more. They're not buying TV ads necessarily.
Right.
They are buying like literature and ways to get their message out to a lot of people.
Right. Absolutely.
Do you have any final words for everyone before we wrap this up?
Oh my gosh. Well, first off, again, thank you for this opportunity, this conversation. I think I'll also just add that my bit.ly, the KDL for LD5, is also all of my social media handles. So please feel free to follow there and keep up with all of the latest hot takes on really hyper local issues and pictures of my dog and everything like that. But yeah, I'm Kristiana de Leon. I'm, really honored to have this opportunity to serve already in my local community. And that kind of work has been both inspiring me and informing me of what is going well and what really needs to be done better in Washington State. And I guess I'll just say to more national viewers is, both really pay attention locally and really make sure that you understand that, even if you think it's a safe blue area, there is still so much work to be done. So don't get complacent, don't give up, get involved.
Well, thank you so much for everything you're doing. I know I'm going to be keeping tabs because I want to see how this plays out. And thank you for all the work you do. I admire it so much. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
Awesome.
See you later, everybody. And again, if you enjoyed this conversation, please share this video with as many people as you can. And please consider making a donation to Kristiana's campaign as well. All right.
Thank you.